Welcome to Voluble Minds, reflections on and abbreviated readings of famous philosophical dialogues. I'm Colin Wulff, Assistant Director of Religious Education at the Fourth Universalist Society in New York City. If you would like to skip the introductory segment on today's philosopher and dialogue and go straight to the reading, the timestamp posted in the video description will help you to do that. Thank you for joining us. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher born in 1711 and dying the year of our nation's founding, 1776. He influenced a range of controversial luminaries, such as the so-called father of capitalism, Adam Smith, the founder of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, and of course the most famous discoverer and exponent of natural selection as the mechanism of evolution, Charles Darwin. He is, along with Locke and Berkeley, considered an empiricist, though he differed from those other two in some of his conclusions and pet issues. Hume's main difference with them is that he is more amiable to skeptics and atheists, groups George Berkeley of the last unit openly detested, and whom John Locke had no scruples about excluding from his otherwise enlightened views of religious toleration. Hume would play a bit on the ambiguity of words like skepticism as something that could also apply to some believers, or that indeed was actually a mark of true piety for those believers who were skeptical enough to avoid believing that humans could have any true or specific insight into that divinity, in which, of course, they all believed. This was different from an absolute skepticism as to any and all existence. But Hume offered a powerful demonstration of the definitionally nonsensical nature of miracles. He is also appreciated for his critique of religion, similar to that of Hobbes, as merely a way to subjugate populations by exploiting their fears and confusion. And also for his proofs against the competency of human judgment to logically deduce the existence of a creator, or at least its particular qualities. In his The Natural History of Religion, Hume envisioned the threat of divine punishment as something that forced those under the God in question to fulsomely and repeatedly profess emphatic adulation and love, lest they even allow a private thought of doubt or dislike to pass through their minds, which of course were not private to the Empyrean authority. Thus, these professions of faith were paradoxically untrustworthy, if not downright illegitimate. Love and belief under compulsion. And this was not conducive to real morality. It provided a totally selfish incentive for even the noblest of virtues enacted in response to this godly fear. However, as was the case for many philosophers up to and in Hume's time and since, the mollifying terms in which he couched his arguments to avoid summary dismissal from Christian institutions came at a cost, something we've now seen repeatedly in this series: Galileo, Hobbes. In denying believers the use of the batteries of reason, Hume also conceded that reason is no more capable of disproving an object of faith than it is of verifying it. That's not strictly wrong, depending on our definition of faith, but skeptics and atheists continue to labor against the gallingly misplaced equivalency of unfalsifiability with probable truth. In the next episode's dialogues concerning natural religion, Hume's mouthpiece Philo quotes Seneca: "To know God is to worship him." This is his dubious out. In the same dialogues, his avatar Philo declares, "A person seasoned with a just sense of the imperfections of natural reason will fly to revealed truth with the greatest avidity. To be a philosophical skeptic is, in a man of letters, the first and most essential step towards being a sound, believing Christian." It's just not the irreligious coup de grace some skeptics might be seeking in Hume's philosophy, though we can appreciate Hume's reasons for striking the tenuous compromise. For though Hume persuasively insulates reason and human sense against their appropriation for the affirmation of faith-based propositions, this requires him in a way to encourage that faith be operative where reason is not appropriate, which goes rather easy on faith's fundamental shortcomings as more than a provision for facts not yet known, or as an innocuous abstraction to vaguely describe human attachment to more subjective concerns. This latter application of faith crops up commonly in less literal-minded or in non-creedal denominations, such as Unitarian Universalism. The Lutheran theologian Paul Tillich, admired by many Unitarian Universalists, would even apply this general poetic interchangeability to the word God, which he defined as one's greatest concern. While Christian writers like C.S. Lewis would find this something of a cop-out, less doctrinally motivated worshippers reluctant to dispense with a religious vocabulary entirely have found this agreeable. And some believers today are perfectly happy not to force their theologies to conform to human reason. C.S. Lewis likewise didn't think that science was a sensible standard for religious truth, and many people have adopted that stance, which is perfectly fine as long as religion isn't making natural claims. In any case, the Tillichian approach, comfortably pliable as it is, has not necessarily helped believers and non communicate about where that line ought to be. These are just some of the branchings of religious interpretation that follow from Hume's self-sparing balancing act. And he can't be blamed for all the difficulties of communication that are anyway consistent with the license he allows faith. But one wonders if in his intermittent prevarication on the epistemological uses of words like faith and skepticism, he missed an opportunity to head off some of these difficulties. It's not the new application of words that is the problem, so much as the tendency for proposed boundaries between the knowable and unknowable, the tangible and metaphorical, to get muddled if we aren't explicit and honest about how it is we are customizing old and embedded terms. For a more robust attempt at determining those things which are in and of themselves knowable versus unknowable, given how we perceive the world, viewers might consult Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. More on him shortly. Hume's seeming knock against reason brings us back to his empirical platform, which is not that the senses give us a perfectly accurate account of being as such, but rather that we should hesitate to project any supposedly reasonable assumptions onto or deduce too elaborately from what the senses deliver to us. We can know what they show, but not what's behind it or underlies it causally. Sometimes Hume even groups human senses and reason fairly close together in cautioning against their fallibility. Our perception of causation was a main talking point for Hume, as it is for so many of our series philosophers. He said that our association with certain events and their effects does not mean that we can always expect to see that association repeated in the future. We must assume some things in order to function in nature and with each other, but there is no logical absolute certainty in anticipating an event. This may seem to bear some resemblance to Malebranche's occasionalism, that we can't be sure that anything of itself has or constitutes the force that influences its environment or anything in it. If there is really anything in it, you might recognize Berkeley in that continuum of thought, hence their empirical link. Immanuel Kant, because we needed to mention at least one more German philosopher not actually represented dialogically in this series, was especially at pains to clarify the material perceptive element of Hume's philosophy and to distinguish it from the more extreme Berkeleyan conclusion in his Kant's confidently titled Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. Kant writes, Hume suffered the usual misfortune of metaphysicians of not being understood. The question was not whether the concept of cause was right, useful, and even indispensable for our knowledge of nature, for this Hume never doubted, but whether that concept could be thought by reason a priori, and consequently whether it possessed an inner truth independent of all experience. This was Hume's problem. It was a question considering the origin of the concept, not concerning its indispensability and use. Were the former decided, the conditions of its use and the sphere of its valid application would have been determined as a matter of course. I thank Classics of Western Philosophy, 2nd edition, edited by Stephen M. Kahn for the Kant quote. In our Hume unit, we will be exploring two different pieces. In this episode, a fragment from Hume's definitive work, An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. It's only the briefest of interludes because the Enquiry is not a dialogue for the most part, but slips into it in the 11th hour, or section, which we will be reading. Our sample here is less concerned with the nature of human knowledge and perception, which we will consider more in the next episode's dialogue, but rather Hume and his friend discuss the development of philosophy itself and free thought and how cultural prejudice and political involvement can curtail or support this end. They also examine the responsibility government leaders might have in taking the health of civil society into account when engaging in philosophical inquiry or deciding how much to permit it. Is it the business of politics to legislate on speculative matters? Isn't that how speculation becomes dogma? Hume's friend posits that dogma is actually descended from free philosophical inquiry, and he expounds on this. They imagine a situation which may harken back to the Platonic dialogue Apology from Unit 1, but this time we swap Socrates for Epicurus, making his defense against accusations of disturbing the peace or threatening the public good with his speculations. We've mentioned Epicurus a couple of times in this series, and he deserves a proper moment. Epicurus' school of thought revolved around a life fulfilled by ataraxia, peace and liberty without anxiety and fear, and aponia, the avoidance of pain. Epicurus has been rather unfairly remembered as advocating for lush and irresponsible indulgence, mostly because of his adoption and personal interpretation of the atomism of Leucippus and his pupil Democritus. I recommend our viewers to undertake their own investigations of the finer points of the development of this early atomism as it passed from thinker to thinker, because it plays a significant role in the ongoing push and pull of theology, the natural sciences, and the philosophical tools which both would claim. In short, Christians, perceiving a threat, sought to discredit Epicurus for his atomistic ideas, and their mischaracterization of his followers as Bacchic roisterers has more or less stuck. Thus, Epicurus, though not suffering Socrates' fate of execution, is a good embodiment of this question. How much freedom should be given philosophical inquiry, and should any consideration of the public good, assuming the public good has been rightly defined, constrain it? The reference to black and white beans at the end refers to the system of voting for acquittal or condemnation. Hume's friend is saying he would earn no votes for condemnation in his eloquent advancement of Epicurus' ideas before a philosophically savvy crowd, thus coming to a different conclusion from Socrates, who didn't think much of his chances of changing the trial's outcome had only his argument been better fashioned. In this dialogue, Hume, though placing himself in the narrative, assigns the prevailing argument to his friend, which may not seem so deft a maneuver by today's standards of didactic storytelling, but it does break with the habits of the previous efforts we have covered so far, with the exception of Boethius. But it may be easier to lose graciously to Lady Philosophy than to our mortal companions. I'm joined today by my friend, computer programmer, and fellow actor, Axandre Oji, another Oberlin graduate. He's a senior software engineer with Capital One. He recently acted in a Zoom production with Convergence Theater called Snapshots, links to which can be found on the Convergence Theater webpage. And you might also recognize his voice as the narrator for the audiobooks of The White Road Tales by Jackie Castle. In the following, he will be reading Hume's Friend to My David Hume. Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding is in the public domain. Enjoy. Our conversation began with my admiring the singular good fortune of philosophy, which, as it requires entire liberty above all other privileges, and chiefly flourishes from the free opposition of sentiment and argumentation, received its first birth in an age and country of freedom and toleration, and was never cramped, even in its most extravagant principles, by any creeds, confessions, or penal statutes. For, except the banishment of Protagoras and the death of Socrates, which last event proceeded partly from other motives, there are scarcely any instances to be met with in ancient history of this bigoted jealousy with which the present age is so much infested. Epicurus lived at Athens to an advanced age in peace and tranquility. Epicureans were even admitted to receive the sacerdotal character and to officiate at the altar in the most sacred rites of the established religion, and the public encouragement of pensions and salaries was afforded equally by the wisest of all the Roman emperors to the professors of every sect of philosophy. How requisite such kind of treatment was to philosophy in her early youth will easily be conceived if we reflect that even at present, when she may be supposed more hardy and robust, she bears with much difficulty the inclemency of the seasons and those harsh winds of calumny and persecution which blow upon her.
You admire, as the singular good fortune of philosophy, what seems to result from the natural course of things, and to be unavoidable in every age and nation. This pertinacious bigotry of which you complain, as so fatal to philosophy, is really her offspring, who, after allying with superstition, separates himself entirely from the interest of his parent, and becomes her most inveterate enemy and persecutor. Speculative dogmas of religion, the present occasions of such furious dispute, could not possibly be conceived or admitted in the early ages of the world, when mankind, being wholly illiterate, formed an idea of religion more suitable to their weak apprehension, and composed their secret tenets of such tales chiefly as were the objects of traditional belief, more than of argument or disputation. After the first alarm, therefore, was over, which arose from the new paradoxes and principles of the philosophers, these teachers seem ever after, during the ages of antiquity, to have lived in great harmony with the established superstition and to have made a fair partition of mankind between them. The former claiming all the learned and wise, the latter possessing all the vulgar and illiterate.
It seems then that you leave politics entirely out of the question, and never suppose that a wise magistrate can justly be jealous of certain tenets of philosophy, such as those of Epicurus, which, denying a divine existence and consequently a providence and a future state, seem to loosen in great measure the ties of morality, and may be supposed for that reason pernicious to the peace of civil society.
I know that these persecutions never in any age proceeded from calm reason or from experience of the pernicious consequences of philosophy, but arose entirely from passion and prejudice. But what if I should advance farther and assert that if Epicurus had been accused before the people by any of his sycophants or informers of those days, he could easily have defended his cause and proved his principles of philosophy to be as salutary as those of his adversaries, who endeavored with such zeal to expose him to the public hatred and jealousy.
I wish you would try your eloquence upon so extraordinary a topic, and make a speech for Epicurus, which might satisfy not the mob of Athens, if you will allow that ancient and polite city to have contained any mob, but the more philosophical part of his audience, such as might be supposed capable of comprehending his arguments.
The matter would not be difficult upon such conditions, and if you please, I shall suppose myself Epicurus for a moment, and make you stand for the Athenian people, and shall deliver you such a harangue as will fill all the urn with white beans and leave not a black one to gratify the malice of my adversaries.
Very well. Proceed upon these suppositions.
I come hither, O ye Athenians, to justify in your assembly what I maintained in my school. And I find myself impeached by furious antagonists instead of reasoning with calm and dispassionate inquirers. Your deliberations, which of right should be directed to questions of public good and the interest of the commonwealth, are diverted to the disquisition of speculative philosophy. And these magnificent but perhaps fruitless inquiries take place of your more familiar but more useful occupations. But so far as in me lies, I will prevent this abuse. We shall not here dispute concerning the origin and government of worlds. We shall only inquire how far such questions concern the public interest. And if I can persuade you that they are entirely indifferent to the peace of society and security of government, I hope that you will presently send us back to our schools, there to examine at leisure the question, the most sublime, but at the same time, the most speculative of all philosophy. The religious philosophers, not satisfied with the tradition of your forefathers and doctrine of your priests, in which I willingly acquiesce, indulge in a rash curiosity in trying how far they can establish religion upon the principles of reason. And they thereby excite instead of satisfying the doubts which naturally arise from a diligent and scrutinous enquiry. They paint in the most magnificent colors the order, beauty, and wise arrangement of the universal, and then ask if such a glorious display of intelligence could proceed from the fortuitous concourse of atoms, or if chance could produce what the greatest genius can never sufficiently admire. It is sufficient if I can prove from this very reasoning that the question is entirely speculative, and that, when in my philosophical disquisitions I deny a providence and a future state, I undermine not the foundations of society, but advance principles, which they themselves, upon their own topics, if they argue consistently, must allow to be solid and satisfactory.